Hello, my friends. This is Baal Kadmon, and I would like to thank you for watching and or listening to this podcast. Today I'm going to read you two incomplete chapters from my latest book that's going to come out very soon called Beelzebub, A History, which is currently in pre-release on Amazon. The reason why I say the two chapters are incomplete is because I'm definitely going to be adding to them. But what I present today is going to be very informative. I go pretty deep into the meaning of the name Beelzebub, how it's evolved over time, and my opinion, and others of course, that Beelzebub is actually not his original name. Before I do that, I just want to give you a quick overview of what will be contained in this book. I'm obviously going to be covering Beelzebub in the Old Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls and pseudepigraphal texts, and of course the New Testament. And we can't discuss Beelzebub without covering the church thinks about him and of course occult literature. And I'm thinking about adding a chapter about Beelzebub how he is portrayed in John Milton's work. I'm still thinking about that one. And I will also include 5 powerful rituals and meditations. And unlike my book on Belial that did not have rituals, I did add them to this particular book because I have worked with Beelzebub before, whereas with Belial I haven't had a lot of experience with him, so I don't like to write about things that I don't have first-hand experience with. So okay, what you are now going to hear, it's 2 chapters, again incomplete chapters, from my book Beelzebub, A History, and they're both going to be involving his name. I hope you enjoy. Beelzebub, what's in a name? The name Beelzebub has an interesting and somewhat controversial origin story. The name itself is actually quite irregular. In English, the name Beelzebub doesn't seem to have much relation to Baal, for example, but that is because it is not rendered correctly from the original language. In Hebrew, Beelzebub is Baal Zvuv. This means Lord of the Flies. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, the term Baal means Lord or Master, and Zvuv means flies. In Hebrew, it is rendered as Baal Zevuv, two words. If spelled properly in English, it would be Baalzevuv. In some cases, it is rendered as Vaal Zevuv, since the B sound in Hebrew can sometimes be rendered as a V sound. We will be seeing this rendering shortly. So let's discuss Beelzebub in the Old Testament. We see this version of Baal, Beelzebub, mentioned only 4 times in the Old Testament. They are within the same book. 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 2 and 3. Now Ahaziah had fallen through the lattice of his upper room in Samaria and injured himself. So he sent messengers, saying to them, Go and consult Baal Zvuv, the god of Ekron, to see if I will recover from this injury. But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbe, Go up and meet the messengers of the king of Samaria and ask them, Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going off to consult Baal Zvuv, the god of Ekron? Now if we look at 2 Kings chapter 1 verse 6, and it says, And they said unto him, There came up a man to meet us, and said unto us, Go, return unto the king that sent you, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Is it because there is no God in Israel that thou sendest to inquire of Baal Zvuv, the god of Ekron? Therefore thou shalt not come down from the bed whither thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. And finally in 2 Kings chapter 1 verse 16 it states, And he said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Forasmuch as thou hast sent messengers to inquire of Baal Zvuv, the god of Ekron, is it because there is no God in Israel to inquire of his word? Therefore thou shalt not come down from the bed whither thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. And as you can see in the Hebrew, it says here, Bevaal Zvuv, in Beelzebub, or of Beelzebub. As you can see, in every instance it mentions Beelzebub, it also associates him with the town of Ekron. This is due to the fact that this form of Baal was worshipped there, just like Baal Peor was worshipped at Peor, and Baal Hermon was worshipped at the Mount Hermon. The Baal name would often be suffixed by the location in which the cult was located. However, in the case of Beelzebub, notice they aren't calling him Baal Ekron, as you would have expected. I will get into why that is in a moment. Let's move on to the Septuagint and its understanding of Beelzebub. The Septuagint is the first Greek translation of the Old Testament. This is the first ever Greek translation, commissioned by the Greek king of Egypt, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, an ancestor to the Greek Egyptian queen Cleopatra. The translation is called the Septuagint after the Latin word Septuaginta, which means 70. Supposedly, it took 70 people to do this, scholars that is, and some people say 72. In either case, it is a good reference point to see how Jewish scholars in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC understood the verses of the Old Testament. As I mentioned before, I feel that there are translational issues with it, but for the purposes of this book, those translational inconsistencies luckily do not apply. The Septuagint is largely in agreement with the Hebrew Bible as it pertains to Baal's description as the Lord of the Flies. Both the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible both being of Jewish origin, I suspect this wouldn't be too surprising that they would agree on many things. But are they correct in their rendering of Beelzebub? I argue that they are not. Let us take a look. Please note that due to the way the Septuagint is compiled, the verses below are not aligned the exact same way as it is in the Hebrew and English versions. For example, the verse in 2 Kings chapter 1 verse 2 and 3 is in the same location in both the Hebrew and English versions. However, in the Septuagint, it is 4 Kings. I will make note of this as I quote them. Let's look at the Septuagint and how it treats the name Beelzebub. This is going to be the Greek version of the Hebrew-English 2 Kings chapter 1 verse 2 and 3. Again, Septuagint 4 Kings chapter 1 verse 2. Δεύτε και επεζητήσατε εν το Βαάλ μίαν θεόν ακαρόν, ή ζήσομαι εκείς τα αρρωστίας μου ταύτης και πορεύθησαν επερώτησε δι αυτού. The words that are highlighted say, Baal mian theon akaron, which literally says, Baal fly, god of Ekron. That is the literal translation. The same usage of this passage, of this exact wording, can be found in the English and Hebrew version, 2 Kings chapter 1 verse 3, which is Septuagint 4 Kings chapter 1 verse 3. The Hebrew and English version, 2 Kings chapter 1 verse 6. The Septuagint is 4 Kings chapter 1 verse 6. And in the Hebrew English versions, 2 Kings chapter 1 verse 16, which is Septuagint 4 Kings chapter 1 verse 16. In both Hebrew and Greek texts, Zevuv in Hebrew and Mian in Greek seem suspect to me. Was there a place in Ekron called Flies? No. The term flies is not an indicator of location in this instance. Some scholars who take a more literal approach to the name suggest that this form of Baal was, in fact, literally a repeller of flies. On the surface, this seems foolish, but there is some suggestion that they obviously knew that flies were vectors of disease and associated with death. So perhaps this form of Baal was a protector against flies, and thus a repeller of disease. This is not unheard of. In ancient texts, especially in the Greek, we have one of Zeus's epithets was Zephs Apomios, or Zeus who drives away flies, or the Greek god Miagrus, whose name means flycatcher, or one who chases flies. He is hailed as a hero because he repelled flies during the festival of Athena. Despite this historical precedent for such use, I don't agree with it when it comes to Beelzebub. I get into that in the next chapter. Zevuv or Zevul? I side with the other camp of scholars that believe that Zevuv was a deliberate distortion of the word Zevul, or Zvul, which means exalted, and in Ugaritic it means prince. This distortion to zevuv, or flies, was a sign of contempt for Baal, essentially making him of no use other than to attract flies, which is simply stating that he is useless. He is a bringer of disease. There is another theory that zevul was just a misspelling for the word for garbage or dung in Hebrew, zevel, essentially the lord of dung or garbage. Again, this is an insult to Baal. That was not his original name. I mean, I can see why some people would think this in the rabbinic community and the Jewish community, but it's hard to prove, and therefore I won't go down the path that his name may mean garbage or dung. Based on everything I have read, the original name was most certainly Baal-Zebul, or Baal-Zebul, and you'll see it in English translations, or the Exalted Lord, and not Lord of the Flies or Beelzebub. It just makes sense. Let me present a few reasons as to why I think this. 1. If you recall the first passage, the biblical passage I presented in the last chapter, we see that King Ahaziah falls and is injured. He requests that Beelzebub should be called upon. It doesn't make sense that he would call Baal the fly repeller for assistance, but rather the exalted Baal, Baal-Zebul, for divinatory purposes. Doesn't that make more sense? 2. In the Ugaritic texts, where we have most of the references to Baal outside of the Bible, often state this when mentioning the god Baal, Baal-Zvul. You see, ZBL, that's in English, is Zvul, which means in Ugaritic, prince. In essence, exalted. They did this for the other gods as well. In the Book of Kings, we come in contact with a princess by the name of Jezebel. She was a Baal worshipper extraordinaire and a Phoenician, and was very much against the Hebrew God. Her name in Hebrew is Izavel. Notice that the last 3 letters of her name, Zevel, in the Ugaritic means prince. Her entire name means, where is the prince? Her father's name was Et-Baal. He is literally named after Baal. His son's name is Baal-Eser. As you see, Baal is embedded in all the names, and Jezebel is also in honor of him, Baal the prince. It ran in their family. 4. And here's the kicker, the evidence to further bolster the claim that Zevul is the correct word. In the New Testament, they use Zevul or Zebul suffix when referring to Beelzebub, Baal or Baal-Zevul. As with the previous point in which he is called a prince in Ugaritic, in Matthew chapter 12 verse 24 it states that Beelzebul is prince of the demons. So that just makes the argument that Zevul is a more likely term for his name. That is his name, Baal-Zevul. It is also interesting to note that the New Testament, which is usually in alignment with the Septuagint, breaks from this notion that it means fly. I will get into the New Testament usage a bit later. Taking all the above into account, it makes sense that it is a distortion of Zevul. The evidence is clearly weighted in that direction, and when you look through time, the Zevul appears more prominently in nearly all texts. I could leave it there, but I also wanted to illustrate that the Israelites did in fact distort names of people when they wanted to insult them. Interestingly enough, they do this to 2 people that actually have the name Baal in their name. It's no coincidence that they do this to their names, and further bolsters why the use of zvuv, or flies, as opposed to zevul, was a distortion and an insult. In my book, Baal, King of the Heavens, I mentioned 2 individuals that had the name Baal as a suffix to their name. Saul's son was named Ishbaal, or man of the Lord. 1 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 33, it says, Ner begot Kish, and Kish begot Saul, and Saul begot Jonathan, and Malchishua, and Abinadab, and Ishbaal. The second example, Jonathan's son bore the name of Meriv-Baal, or the Lord contends or fights. That's 1 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 34. And the son of Jonathan was Meriv-Baal, and Meriv-Baal begot Micha. The reason why I mentioned this is because in 2 Samuel, those same names that had Baal now have them removed, and the word they replace for Baal is Boshet, which means shame. Here, let's take a look. 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 8. Now Avner, the son of Ner, captains of Saul's host, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. Wait, I thought Saul's son was named Ishbaal, but here his name is Ishbosheth, which means man of shame. Now let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4. Now Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son that was lame of his feet. He was 5 years old when the tidings came of Saul and Jonathan out of Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And it came to pass, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. In the previous verse, Jonathan's son was Meriv Baal. Now his name is Mephibosheth, which means out of my mouth is shame. I find this change rather suspicious, don't you? Why the word shame? It was due to two reasons. One, the names were clearly Baal-centric. And two, it was to degrade those two people, to insult them by removing the Baal name, which was clearly reference to Baal but also can mean Lord. They changed it to Boshet, which is shame. So they did the same thing with Beelzebub. They added the Zebub or Zevuv to Baal to shame him, saying, oh, you're just Lord of the Flies. But his real name is Baal Zevul, or the Exalted Lord. As you can see, there is precedence for the Zevul usage, and it appears it was apparently not the first time they did this when the name of Baal was used, as you just saw. However, despite the above, I will still refer to him as Beelzebub or Baal-Zvuv throughout the text for consistency purposes only. And, well, Lord of the Flies just sounds so much cooler than the milquetoast Exalted Lord, doesn't it? In summary, the Old Testament simply acknowledges him as an aspect of the god Baal. His demonization comes later in time. However, for consistency purposes, I will be referring to him as a demon, even if I don't personally feel he is one in the true sense of the word. There you have it, my friends, two fairly academic chapters from my upcoming book, Beelzebub, A History, which is in pre-release on Amazon. As you can see, it's actually quite a complex text, but I do hope that you enjoyed this, and I know it's a little controversial, but in reality, it really shouldn't change how we view Beelzebub, in the sense that just because we would, let's say we would drop the Zebub part of his name and put it as Zevul, doesn't change the fact of what he represents in the various different texts. I, for one, like the term Beelzebub. I think, like I said earlier in the chapter, I think it's actually more interesting, but really it's Baal-Zevul. And that's about it. I hope you're well. So mote it be.